Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review, and in this video I'm going to review the Liquified Throne of Simplicity by Širom. Another one of those world music releases that you can find out of Glitterbit Records, a label that so far has proven to just bring some of the best material when it comes to world music in general. Now this is a label where I've talked about some of their previous releases because for me this is a label that has put out some really cool stuff. Now this is one of those albums that seems to gain a bit more attention than the usual stuff. This is one of those albums that I've actually seen a lot of people actually mentioning and talk about it. It has already managed to be one of the most talked about albums the label has put out so far, which is something that we see in a few occurrences, and this is one of those cases as well, which is somewhat surprising considering that we didn't see that much of a traction with the previous album, which I ended up listening to it a while ago. This was actually one of the first releases that I've listened to out of this label, and I believe that it was a pretty decent work in terms of just having all of those traditional instruments blending together and making for some intriguing combination of sounds and Avant-Folk elements, but it wasn't that much of a striking album in my opinion. It wasn't one that really caught my attention that much, which is something that kinda changes with this brand new release over here, which I find it to be much more worth of your attention, and I can see why lots of people seem to put this album in high regard as one of the most intriguing releases of this year. This one in comparison feels like a much more well realized and fully fleshed album, with 4 massive songs and almost 70 minutes of material. There is a lot going on into this album in terms of just being a really lengthy album that requires a lot of time and a bit of an attention to it. Now these songs go into an avant-folk direction with many sort of avant-garde elements and free improvisation, but there is also another phase into these songs that goes into some more minimal approaches. The thing is that those really lengthy songs don't just simply go into this messy, chaotic approach with nothing really making all that much of a sense and just being free improvised stuff that don't necessarily seem to lead anywhere. Instead, the free improvised elements are combined with certain elements that just go into some pretty similar and minimal patterns, and those sections can last very long and just go into the same direction over and over again, but we see a sense of progression as there would be some change-ups as the tracks would progress. I mean, we're talking about pretty lengthy songs, and it's nice just to see a pattern created with those songs and feeling much more purposeful and more fleshed out. So I believe that those elements manage to make the tracks stand out more on their own, and the more minimal approaches throughout this whole album do make for some of the most compelling elements that you can find out of this whole project. It's also nice that we see a great blend of all of the sounds coming together. This is a pretty varied album when it comes to the instrumentation. You have those minimal elements, but outside of that there is a lot going on with all of the other instrumentations that would go into multiple different avant-garde and free improvised directions. All of those moments though have a certain balance to them, as you never feel really overwhelmed with what is going on with the instrumentation or like necessarily creating something chaotic. It's more of a psychedelic release that focuses quite a lot on its minimalism and the way it tries to evoke its emotions and making you feel. Despite a few directions which don't really seem that easy to approach, for the most part we're talking about a somewhat soothing release that is easy to the ears and easy to just sit through and relax. But it's also interesting that in many occasions it feels like it's done with a pretty dark tone surrounding this whole thing. And another thing that makes this album work quite well is its excellent recordings. This is an album that sounds really good. There is some really good work when it comes to the mixing, and I like how all of the instruments basically blend together and sounding pretty distinct one from each other. And like I said, we get many different approaches when it comes to the instrumentation over here. We have traditional elements mixed with a blend of like avant-folk with minimal elements that you can see with percussion, and then you have multiple strings and horn segments that basically make up for the majority of the free improvised elements that you would find in this album. And I believe that all of the positive things I'm mentioning over here are quite apparent with the very first song, which for me is the biggest highlight out of this album. This is a massive 20-minute song that has many different elements to it, all of them blending so well together. It is nice how you basically have those really minimal segments that just go on and on, but they're also combined with all of those free improvised sections that sound really good. And then the track progresses, and as it goes on, it manages to flow in a really nice way and having a few different elements to it, in the way that some of the instruments end up fading away and adding nuance to the mix. But as far as I really like what the track does overall, I believe that the best segment is towards the end, with the final minutes really managing to set a somewhat different note, as it would seem like a somewhat of a more unsettling direction in the way it sounds and the atmosphere it creates. And I like how it's this great combination of those string sections that sound kinda melancholic and sad, but then you have the horn segments that feel like they go more into a horrifying aesthetic. It's a really intriguing combination of moods and sounds, and I believe that it's done in a pretty interesting and fascinating way over here. The second track I would also consider to be another great moment. It is a somewhat more uplifting and cheerful song, but it's more in the sense that it manages to be a quite soothing moment that has a bit of a contrast with what the album did previously with the first song, but I really like this change of direction and the way it progresses and how it goes. It makes for a quite nice change of pace. It sets a different mood, and it's also another track that manages to be effective for what it tries to do. The unfortunate thing is that the album doesn't really seem to keep the same momentum as it goes on. It's not like it's really going that much downhill, but I believe it's at that point where we see the album kinda get a bit tiring and a bit boring. For example, for me the third track is a pretty decent moment. I can find many elements out of it that I would find pretty enjoyable. However, I also feel that this is the first moment where some of the parts feel somewhat lackluster or that they drag on for really long. This is an 18-minute song, and in my opinion there are a few sections that could have been a bit shorter that go on for too long, and they don't really feel that they're that much captivating or that they manage to do all that much to the song. I still though believe that there are some pretty cool elements to it, and while the fourth track is somewhat more varied and has a bit of a more progression and different phases to it, I would also argue that it contains some of the least compelling elements out of this whole album. Basically at this point it's more of the same formula, and for me this fourth track is not really executed all that nicely in order to manage to provide something all that different in the track listing or just having something new and refreshing for the album. It's basically elements that we've heard before and in my opinion just done a bit better. Finally, there's the fifth song, which is the only short moment over here, going for 3 minutes. It is the one song that seems to have its most fleshed out idea and going the least into those weird avant-garde free improvised sections. This is more of a standard song that at this point I believe it basically just shares elements that we've heard from the previous songs. It seems to have a bit of a more focus into some of those operatic vocals that we do get in a few other occasions in the track listing as well, but apart from a few intriguing elements, it's not that much of a gratifying finisher. I wouldn't necessarily say that it feels out of place, just like having this really short moment at the end after 4 massive tracks, but it gets quickly apparent that there is not really that much into this particular finisher. I believe that it's simply serviceable. With that being said, even if it's not as strong towards its second half, I still enjoy this album. I believe that it's a pretty cool project with a nice combination of traditional music and many other genres. I like the variety to the instrumentation and how good every one of the instruments sounds. In terms of ideas, there seem to be some really good foundations over here, but it's an album that goes for really long. This is an album that needs a bit of a patience, but I do strongly recommend you, especially if you're looking for a world music release. This is one of those out of Glitterbit Records that seems to gain the most attention, and I can see why. In a sense, I could say that this is one of the coolest releases that I've heard this year so far. I'm gonna give the Liquified Throne of Simplicity a 7 out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why? And what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.